The carriage door had not yet stopped swinging when she stepped down into the gravel, and the gravel, for its part, declined to forgive her. It bit through the thin soles of her boots in a way that made counting useful. 12 paces from the carriage to the lowest step. 6 steps up to the door. 1 breath held for the length of the bell pull. She had a few seconds, she thought, to decide who she would be when the door opened, and she had spent the entire journey deciding to be no one but herself, which was, of course, the most dangerous decision available to a woman in want of employment. A great house has a particular silence at 2:30 in the afternoon. It is the silence of rooms that have learned not to expect to be needed. The bell answered her with a politeness that was almost an insult, and a footman she did not look at long enough to remember opened the door without surprise. He had, she suspected, opened it 12 times already this month for women in better cloaks than hers, and 12 times closed it behind them. She offered her name and her letter, and the footman accepted both as though receiving a parcel he was not certain he would keep. "You are expected," he said, which was the first lie of the afternoon, since no one in this house had expected her in any meaningful sense for some time. She was expected only as the next of a series, the way rain is expected in a wet month. Still, she inclined her head and followed him across a hall whose floor had been polished to such a sheen that her own reflection walked beneath her, upside down and slightly behind, a sister she had not invited and could not quite send away. The morning room into which she was shown was warmer than it had any right to be, given the cold of the corridors. A fire had been lit, but not recently, and the heat had grown thoughtful in the air, settling on the backs of chairs and the spines of books. There were 3 chairs arranged in a kind of judicial half-moon, and a table set with a single cup of tea, untouched, the surface of it already paled by a skin. She did not sit. She had been told nothing about sitting, and in houses such as this one, sitting was a question one preferred to be asked. She used the weight to count, because counting was a habit older than her circumstances. 12 panes in the tall window, 4 logs in the basket, 1 pianoforte, closed, 2 portraits, both of women, both unsmiling, both wearing the same emerald at the throat, as though the emerald had outlived its owners and gone in search of new necks. She counted, too, the months since her last position, and then chose not to count those, because precision in some matters is merely a way of bleeding slowly. When the door opened again, it did not announce itself. She turned only when the room rearranged itself around the presence of someone new, the way a pond rearranges around a thrown stone before the stone is seen. He was already half across the carpet by the time she found him, taller than she had imagined, though she had refused, on principle, to imagine him much. He wore mourning, but the kind that had outlived its sharpness, the black gone soft at the elbows. His face was composed in the manner of men who have been composed for a very long time, the muscles of his jaw having learned, like servants, not to speak first. "You are the 13th, he said. He did not say it cruelly. He said it the way a man might note the number of a year, or the page upon which a sentence has been waiting for him. She felt the words settle somewhere just below her collarbone and decided not to move it. "Yes, Your Grace," she said. He gestured her to a chair, and she sat, and the chair received her with the small sigh of upholstery that has been sat upon by many hopefuls. He took the chair opposite, not the one in the center, which she noticed, because the chair in the center was clearly meant for someone else, someone absent, and the empty chair did more talking, in those first moments, than either of them. He had a folio on his knee, thin, neat, tied with a black ribbon, and she understood at once that the folio contained her, or the version of her that he had been permitted to receive. Letters of recommendation, A list of households. The neat outline of a life made small enough to be ribboned. He did not open it. That, she thought, was either a courtesy or a verdict already reached. "Tell me," he said, "what you understand of the position." She had prepared an answer for this on the road, 3 answers in fact, arranged by length, and she chose the middle one. "There is a child," she said, "a daughter, 8 years old, who has not had a governess remain longer than a month in the past year. The household is in mourning. The child is, by reasonable accounts, considered difficult. The position requires patience, discretion, and a willingness to teach without the comfort of being thanked." He did not smile, but something moved at the corner of his mouth that, in a less guarded face, would have been the beginning of one. The folio went still in his hands. "Reasonable accounts," he repeated. She inclined her head. "I have learned, Your Grace, to read what is written, and to listen to what is omitted." The omissions, in this case, were louder than the recommendations. He looked at her then, properly, for the first time, and she felt the look not as scrutiny, but as accounting, the way a man counts coin he has not yet decided to spend. Gray eyes, not cold, but trained to seem so. A scar at the temple so faint it might have been a crease in the light. He had been handsome, she thought, in the way that some men are handsome before they decide it would be safer not to be. "You have been a governess in 4 houses," he said. He had then opened the folio without opening it. The information lived in him already. 4 houses, she agreed. 3 of them happy with my service. I cared for the 4th household. The 4th household, in the end, did not require care so much as silence, and silence was not within my gift. He did not ask which. He marked it somewhere behind his eyes and moved on. "You are the daughter of a clergyman. Yes, educated at home. Yes, you speak French. I do. Italian, passably, Latin, better than passably," she said. And then, "Because the day required some small honesty," she added, "though my Greek is the thing I am proud of, and the thing no one ever asks for." This time, he did not even allow the corner of his mouth its small movement. He merely closed the folio over his fingers, keeping his place, and set it aside as if the page were no longer the page he had come to read. "There were 12 before you," he said. "Some did not last a day. Some did not last a sentence. One left so quickly that her gloves are still upstairs in a drawer, the housekeeper informs me, and we have not had the heart to send them on. I tell you this not to discourage you, but because you have, I see an unusual interest in what is omitted, and the omission in this household is large enough to deserve naming." She kept very still. The fire spoke once into the silence, the small grumble of a log shifting. She watched a thin curl of smoke find the chimney, hesitate, then go. "Why do you suppose?" he said at last. "The 12 did not last. It was a test, of course. She had expected tests, though she had not expected them so soon, and she had not expected them to be set down on the table so plainly, like a piece on a board. May I ask you a question first, Your Grace?" she said. The room did something at that. She felt it. The chairs, the portraits, the closed pianoforte, the patient tea, they all leaned, very slightly, the way crowds lean toward a fight that has not yet begun. He did not answer at once. He looked at her with a careful, almost surgical attention, as though deciding whether to be amused or affronted, and finding, perhaps to his own surprise, that he was neither. "You may," he said. She drew breath and chose the question that had been with her since the carriage. It was not the question she had rehearsed. The rehearsed question was clever, and clever questions, she had learned, never opened the doors one truly needed opened. The unrehearsed question was the small, plain one she had been carrying in her mouth like a coin she had not been sure she would spend. "Your Grace," she said, "when was the last time your daughter laughed?" He did not answer. He did not say, "I do not know." And he did not say "last week." And he did not say the words children laugh often, the way fathers say such words to deflect questions they cannot bear. He simply did not answer. The folio rested on the table at his elbow, and his hand rested on the folio, and his thumb moved once along the black ribbon as though smoothing something that needed to be told it was loved. She let the silence hold. She had learned in 4 households that the question one asks an employer is less important than the silence one is willing to keep after it. People who are accustomed to ruling rooms are not accustomed to rooms that decline to be ruled. She watched the smoke find the chimney again. She counted 3 logs left in the basket, and then 4, because one had shifted forward. When he spoke, it was not an answer. It was not an evasion either. It was the voice of a man who had discovered, perhaps in that very moment, that the question had not in fact been asked of his daughter at all. "That," he said, "is a question I cannot answer today." He paused. "Whether I will be able to answer it tomorrow is, it seems, your work to decide." She inclined her head. Not in triumph. She did not feel triumph. She felt the small, dangerous tenderness one feels for something one has not yet been given permission to love. She inclined her head as one inclines it toward a confession received and not repeated, and she said, very quietly, "Then I shall begin tomorrow, Your Grace, if you will have me." He looked at her for what felt like the length of an afternoon, and then he stood. He did not extend his hand. Dukes did not, and even if they did, this one would not have, today, but he walked her to the door himself, which was a thing the footman noticed and the housekeeper noticed, and which would, in the manner of all great houses, be known in the kitchens before the bell rang for supper. At the door he paused. "The other 12, he said, and his voice was lower, almost private, "did not ask me anything at all." "Why did you?" She considered, for half a breath, whether to answer plainly. Plainness, she had decided, on the gravel, was the only honest currency she had brought into this house, because— "Your Grace," she said, "the question I was sent to answer is whether I can teach your daughter. The question I came to answer is whether anyone here has been listening to her. I could not afford to confuse them." He inclined his head, very slightly, the way men in his position incline their heads when they wish to acknowledge a remark without admitting they have been struck by it. The door opened. The hall received her again, and her upside-down sister walked beneath her, and the footman, looking less certain than he had on her arrival, conducted her out into the gravel that no longer felt quite so insulted by her boots. She had counted 12 panes in the window of the morning room. She would, in time, count 12 other things in this house. But the first thing she counted on the journey to the small inn where her trunk waited was 13, the number she had been called, and she did it twice, because she wanted the number to know that she had heard it and did not intend to be defined by it. The inn was modest, the kind that pretended to know graces beyond a clean hearth and a discreet landlady, and she was grateful for both. She did not sleep well. She did not expect to. She lay in the narrow bed and listened to the small night of a country road, the occasional shift of a horse in the stable, the distant complaint of an owl who had, she suspected, opinions, and she set out in her mind the things she did not know about the house she would enter in the morning. She did not know the name of the child. She had been told only that the daughter was 8, and that she was, by reasonable accounts, considered difficult. She did not know what difficult meant, in that house, in that mouth. Difficult, in households she had served, had meant a great many things. It had meant a girl who read at the dinner table. It had meant a boy who refused to be photographed. It had meant a child who would not stop asking, after the death of a mother, when the mother would be coming home. Difficult was usually the word adults used for grief they did not want to name. She did not know what had happened to the Duchess, only that there was mourning, and that the mourning had outlived its sharpness in his coat. She did not know who sat in the center chair when it was occupied, or who had sat in it last, or whether it had been left empty on purpose for her interview, or merely left empty as the chair in the center had always been left empty, since she did not know why the 12 before her had failed. She had her suspicions. She had laid them out in the carriage like cards. The first card, she thought, was that the household had not been hiring a governess. The household had been auditioning a witness. 12 women had stood where she had stood, and 12 women had asked the questions one asks an employer, and 12 women had been quietly let go, not because they were unequal to the schoolroom, but because they were unequal to the silence. The silence was the position. She turned this thought in her mind until the candle guttered, and then she sat up and trimmed the candle and lay down again. The silence was the position, and the silence was a child, and the silence was a father, and somewhere in the middle of the silence was a small thing that had once laughed and had now forgotten how, and she had been hired. If she had been hired, to remember on its behalf. She rose before the maid came with the water. She dressed carefully, but not finely. She had 3 good dresses, and she chose the plainest, because a child suspicious of strangers required a strangeness as small as could be managed. She braided her hair without a mirror, by feel, the way her mother had taught her when mirrors had been a thing the parsonage did not afford. She drank tea she did not taste. She paid the landlady, who refused half her offering, and said, in the voice of a woman who knew everything that happened within 5 miles, that the trap from the great house would call for her at 9. The trap was, in fact, called for her at 8:30, which she took as either a kindness or a test, and which she met by being already in her cloak in the parlor, reading a book she had brought from her father's shelves, and which she had nearly memorized, but which she liked to hold. The boy who drove the trap was perhaps 16, and shy, and he handled the reins with a gentleness that told her more about the housekeeper than any letter could have. He did not speak the whole drive, but he twice slowed the pony at places where the road dipped, so that she would not be jostled, and she thanked him for both, and he colored to the brim of his cap, and she liked him at once. The house in the morning light looked less like a verdict. It had the long, low patience of houses built before fashion had insisted on towers. Ivy had been allowed at one wall and forbidden at another, and the ivy had taken its instructions in good humor. The gravel, this time, did not bite. She thought foolishly that she had begun to be known here, though she had been known here exactly the length of 1 cup of skinned tea. The housekeeper met her at a side door, which she also took as either a kindness or a test, and her name, the housekeeper said, was Mrs. Halford, and she was to be addressed as Mrs. Halford, and the rooms were this way. Mrs. Halford was perhaps 50, with the kind of face that had taught itself, over many years, to give nothing to strangers, and everything to those whom it had decided to keep. She had not yet decided about the new governess, which the new governess respected, and she did not pretend otherwise. The schoolroom is at the top of the east stair, Mrs. Halford said. Miss Cordelia takes her lessons there from 9:30 until 12, and again from 2 until 4. She has had, this past year, 6 governesses in this room, and 6 elsewhere in the country, and I will not lie to you, Miss Aveline, she has not been gentle with any of them. She paused at the foot of the stair and turned. Nor have they been gentle with her. Aveline inclined her head. I am not, she said, an especially gentle person, Mrs. Halford, but I am a patient one. Mrs. Halford considered her for a long moment. the kind of moment in which housekeepers in great houses decide whether to lend the new arrival their goodwill, which is the only currency that matters below stairs. "We shall see," Mrs. Halford said. Which was, Aveline understood, more generous than it sounded. The east stair was narrow, and the schoolroom at the top of it had once been a nursery, and had not entirely forgotten. A rocking horse, faded but loved, stood retired in a corner. A globe with a small crack across the equator sat on a stand by the window. The window looked out over a kitchen garden in which a gardener was bent over a row of something green, and beyond that, a slope of grass. And beyond that, the suggestion of woods. The room smelled of chalk and old wool, and a faint, surprising sweetness she identified, after a moment, as a pear that had been left on a sill until it had begun, politely, to surrender. The child was already there. She had positioned herself at the window, with her back to the door, and she did not turn when Aveline entered. She was small for 8, with hair the color of wet straw drawn into 2 unequal plaits, the unevenness of which suggested either an unsteady hand or a refusal to sit still for a steady one. She wore a dress that had been good once and was good still, in the way that things in this house had been good once and were good still, with the softness of repeated wear. "Good morning," Aveline said, and did not advance. She set her book on the table at the center of the room and her gloves beside it, and waited. The child did not answer. The child watched the gardener bend and rise and bend and rise, and the gardener, having no idea he was being watched only the green thing in his hands. Aveline did not say good morning again. She had learned in 4 households that a greeting refused was not improved by repetition. She walked, instead, to the globe and put her hand on it lightly, as one puts a hand on the head of a dog one has just met, and turned it half an inch, no more, just enough to feel the small resistance of its axis. Then she sat at the table and opened her book and began to read it silently, as though she had come to the schoolroom not to teach, but to be left in peace with a passage that had been troubling her on the road. It took the child 4 minutes. Aveline counted, because counting was a habit older than her circumstances. 4 minutes, during which the gardener bent and rose perhaps 7 times, and the pear on the sill collapsed a fraction further into its own sweetness, and the rocking horse, jostled by nothing, rocked once on its own as though remembering. Then the child turned and looked at her and said in the clear, cold voice of a small person who has decided that adults are largely a disappointment, "You are the 13th. Aveline did not look up at once. She finished her sentence. She marked her place with a thin ribbon. She closed the book. Then she met the child's eyes, which were the same gray as her father's, and trained to seem the same way, and not quite succeeding. "I am," she said. "And you are Cordelia." The child considered this as if it were a proposition she had not yet agreed to. "I am called Cordelia," she said at last. "I am not certain I am Cordelia. The other 12 called me Cordelia, and I did not feel called." "Then I shall not call you Cordelia," Aveline said, "until you tell me what to call you." "I shall call you, in the meantime, nothing at all, which is a thing one can do politely if one is careful with one's sentences." The child did not smile, but her face did the thing her father's had done in the morning room, the very small thing at the corner of the mouth that was the beginning of a smile if one had not, long ago, decided that beginnings were not safe. She came away from the window and stood at the other side of the table, not sitting, and looked at the book. "What are you reading?" "A book about a girl who is sent to a house," Aveline said, "and does not know how to behave in it, and decides, in the end, that not knowing is the only honest place to begin." "Does she like the house?" Not at first. Does the house like her? It learns to. The child considered this also. She put one finger on the edge of the table and pressed and lifted it and pressed, and Aveline saw. As the small finger lifted, the faint half-moon mark it left on the wood, and thought, with a tenderness that surprised her, that this was the shape grief took in a child of 8 in a house in mourning. Half-moons pressed into wood, plats unequal at the ends, a pear allowed to soften because no one had remembered to take it away. You are not going to ask me, the child said, why the other 12 left. I am not, Aveline said. Why? Because, Aveline said, you did not ask me, the moment I came in, why I had come. You are owed the same courtesy. The child turned this over, and her fingers stopped pressing, and she sat, finally, at the table opposite Aveline, with the formality of a small person who has decided to grant an audience. The morning sun, which had been considering the matter, finally settled on her plaits and made the wet straw briefly gold. Then ask me something else, she said. Aveline thought for a moment. Outside, the gardener straightened, put a hand to the small of his back, and looked up at the sky in the manner of gardeners everywhere, conferring with weather that had no intention of replying. The pear on the sill did its quiet work. The rocking horse held still. When, Aveline said, was the last time you laughed? The child's gray eyes did not change. But something moved behind them, and Aveline saw it, and chose not to name it, because some movements in the eyes of children are the kind that flee at the sound of their own names. The child looked down at the table, at the small half-moon she had pressed and could no longer see, and her unequal plaits fell forward. I do not remember, she said. Then we shall, Aveline said. Find out together. She did not say it kindly. Kindness, she had learned, was a thing children in mourning could not yet bear, because kindness came in voices that reminded them of voices that no longer spoke. She said it as one says a thing in a ledger, a thing to be entered and accounted for and balanced in time. The child heard her say it that way and did not look up, but the small finger did not begin pressing again either, which was, in its way, an answer. They began with Latin, because Latin was, Aveline had decided on the road, the safest of the languages for a child who did not wish to be reached. Latin did not ask one to feel. Latin asked one to decline, to conjugate, to fit small certainties into small boxes, and small certainties in small boxes were, she thought, exactly what an 8-year-old in mourning required of a morning. The child knew more Latin than she pretended to. Aveline noted this and did not mention it, and adjusted by half the pace at which she had intended to move. They moved instead at the pace the child set, which was the pace of someone walking a path she did not wish to be seen enjoying. At 11, a bell rang somewhere in the house, and the child rose without being told, and went to the window and watched the gardener walk away across the slope. Aveline did not ask. She suspected that the bell, in this house, had meanings the household no longer explained, and she did not wish to be the one who required them to be explained again. The child returned to the table without comment, and they resumed. At 12, Mrs. Halford appeared at the door with a tray and the same considering face, and set the tray down, and looked at the child, and looked at Aveline, and inclined her head 1/4 of an inch, which Aveline understood as the granting of a probationary goodwill. The tray held bread and a small dish of preserves and 2 cups of milk, and Aveline noticed that there were 2 of everything, even though governesses in the houses she had served had usually eaten alone or in the housekeeper's room. She did not remark upon it. She poured the milk for the child first, and then for herself, and the child noticed this also, and noticed that she did not remark upon it, and an unspoken thing passed between them which neither, by mutual unspoken agreement, named. When the bread was nearly finished, the child said, very carefully, "My mother used to sit at this table." Aveline did not look up. She buttered a small piece of crust, slowly. "Tell me about her," she said. "She was," the child said, and stopped. She tried again. "She was not," the child said, and stopped again, and Aveline saw, with a quiet ache, that the child did not yet possess the sentences for the woman she had lost, that the language of mourning had not yet been taught to her, that the household around her had perhaps refused to teach it, because to teach it would be to admit it. Aveline took a small bite of the buttered crust and chewed it and waited. "She was the one," the child said at last, "who knew when I was hungry without my having to ask." Aveline nodded once, gravely, as though the child had said something extraordinary, which the child had. "That," she said, "is the most important thing one person can know about another. It is also the hardest. We shall not, you and I, expect it of each other for a long time, but we shall practice, perhaps, in small ways, so that one day, if you should wish to teach me, you will know how." The child looked at her for a long moment. Then she picked up her cup of milk in both hands, like a much smaller child, and drank, and set the cup down, and a thin moustache of milk lay across her upper lip, and she did not wipe it away, and Aveline did not, by either word or gesture, point it out. They returned to Latin. That afternoon, between 2 and 4, they read. The child chose, and her choice was a book of fairy tales so worn at the spine that Aveline knew, without asking, that it had been read aloud to her, and the voice that had read it aloud was no longer in the house. The child handed the book across the table without saying anything, and opened it to a page that had been marked, long ago, with a pressed primrose, brown now and as thin as paper itself. Aveline took the book and saw the primrose and did not move it. She began to read where the primrose lay. She read for an hour. The child did not interrupt. The light moved across the table the way light moves in rooms that have been read in for a long time, settling first on the page, then on the small hands folded near the page, then on a corner of the carpet that had been worn pale by feet she had not yet seen. When Aveline reached the end of the tale, she did not close the book. She left the primrose on its page, and she set the book down between them, and she said, "That is enough for today, I think," and the child, after a moment, nodded. At 4, the bell rang again, the same bell, and the child rose, and looked at the window once more, and did not go to it. Instead, she turned to Aveline, and stood very straight, the way children stand when they have been taught that the body must speak when the voice cannot, and she said, very formally, "Thank you, Miss Aveline." "Thank you," Aveline said, and inclined her head as though to an equal, which, in that moment, the child was. The child went to the door. At the door, she paused and put her hand on the frame, and did not turn. "You may," she said, very quietly, "call me Delia. My mother called me Delia, no one else does." "Then I shall," Aveline said, "only when we are alone." "Yes," the child said, "only then." And she was gone, the door closing softly behind her with the particular care of a child who has decided, for reasons not yet known to her, not to slam it. Aveline sat alone in the schoolroom for some minutes after, with the worn book between her hands and the primrose between its pages, and she looked at the pair on the sill, which had now wholly surrendered, and at the rocking horse, which had not moved, and at the globe with its small crack across the equator. She thought of the Duke in the morning room, the folio under his thumb, the unanswered question hanging in the air between them like a struck bell that had not yet stopped sounding. She thought of the 12 gloves in a drawer somewhere upstairs, and of the empty chair at the center of the half moon, and of a bell that rang at 11 and 4 for reasons no one explained. She did not know, yet, what had happened in this house. She did not know why a child of 8 had unequal plaits, or why a duke wore mourning gone soft at the elbows, or why a household had been hiring witnesses and calling them governesses. She did not know what the bell meant. She did not know whose name was not spoken at the table, or why the center chair was kept empty, or why a pear had been allowed to soften on a sill. She did not know, and she did not, on that first afternoon, attempt to find out. She only knew that she had been asked a question she had not been asked in the morning room, the question of whether she could remain, and that she had answered it not in words, but in a primrose left where it had been laid. She rose, and she put on her cloak, and she went down the east stair to the side door, where Mrs. Halford waited with a lamp, though it was not yet dark. The lamp was, she understood, a courtesy, the kind of courtesy great houses extend not to strangers, but to those whom they have decided, provisionally, to keep. Mrs. Halford did not say so. Mrs. Halford only said, "The trap will take you to the inn, Miss Aveline. The trap will fetch you in the morning at the same hour." "Thank you, Mrs. Halford," Aveline said. At the door, Mrs. Halford paused, and her hand on the latch was the hand of a woman who had decided, against her better judgment, to risk a sentence. "The Duke," she said, "asked after the schoolroom at 3. He has not asked after the schoolroom in 7 months." Aveline did not answer, because Mrs. Halford did not require an answer, only an audience for the small fact she had decided to share. She inclined her head, and Mrs. Halford inclined hers, and the door opened, and the gravel this time did not bite at all. In the trap, the shy boy did not speak, and she did not require him to. She watched the slope of grass go by, and the suggestion of woods, and a sky which had the early lavender of evenings that have not yet decided what to be, and she thought, with a steadiness she had not allowed herself in some time, that she had a great deal of work to do, and that the work was not Latin, and not French, and not even the reading of fairy tales with primroses pressed inside, though those were the means. The work was a question, asked once in a morning room, and not yet answered. The work was teaching a house, very slowly, how to answer it. The inn received her without ceremony. The landlady gave her a bowl of broth without asking whether she had wanted broth, which was the kind of attention Aveline most respected, and she ate it in the parlor, with the book open on the table beside her, not reading. She thought of the Duke's thumb on the black ribbon. She thought of the small finger pressing half-moons into wood. She thought of the bell that rang at 11 and at 4. She thought of the chair in the center of the half-moon, and of who might once have sat in it. If you have ever, dear listener, walked into a room you had not been welcomed in, and felt the chairs and the portraits and the patient tea lean ever so slightly to take your measure, you will know already the weather of that first afternoon. If you have ever stood before someone who held a folio of you in their hands and chose, in the end, not to open it. If you have ever asked a question that was not the clever one, but the small plain one you had been carrying in your mouth like a coin you were not sure you would spend, and watched the room go still around it. If you have ever met a child whose grief had not yet been given sentences, and decided to sit at the table with that child and wait, without naming the waiting, until a primrose was offered across the wood, then you know already what kind of house Aveline had walked into, and what kind of work she had been hired, without quite being hired, to do. Stay with me a while longer by this fire. There is far more of this story to tell, and the bell at 11 has its reasons, and the empty chair at the center of the half-moon has its name, and the Duke, who could not answer one question in a morning room, will, before we are done, be asked others he has spent a great many months learning not to hear. Tell me, before we go on, Which moment, so far, has stayed with you most? Was it the gravel, biting through the thin soles of her boots? Was it the folio resting under his thumb, unopened? Was it the child at the window, turning at last after 4 counted minutes? Was it the primrose, brown as paper, left where it had been laid? Whichever it was, hold it gently. We shall need it again. And if you have found, in these first hours by the fire, that this is the kind of story you wish to hear told slowly, in the old way, with the lamp turned low and the world held at a kind distance, then settle in beside me for the next one, and the one after that. There will always be a chair kept for you here, and a tale begun in the small hours, and a voice that does not hurry. Until then, sleep gently, dear listener, and may the questions you have not yet been able to answer be asked of you one day by someone patient enough to wait.